4:30 in the morning, and the phone will not stop lighting up. A message from a man in a rented room asks how soon he can get the money. A mother overseas asks whether there is any way to save her son besides waiting on a list that moves too slowly. Someone he has never met, reached through 3 other people, asks one question: "Can you help?" He answers none of them yet. He drinks something warm, looks at the ceiling, and thinks about the version of himself his neighbors know. That version goes to an ordinary job. This version brokers kidneys. This is not the confession of a real, identifiable trafficker. It is a dramatized composite built from documented cases and research on how this trade functions, allowing us to examine something the world rarely sees directly. The unanswered messages are not evidence that he commands the situation. They show how many people are already searching for an answer before he appears. In this composite reconstruction, every request carries a different kind of pressure, but the pattern is the same. Need creates an opening, and the intermediary presents himself as the person who can cross it. The apparent control begins with other people's lack of alternatives. Researchers who study this trade call it trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal. The phrase sounds bureaucratic, but the definition is specific. A person is exploited for an organ through coercion, deception, or abuse of their vulnerability. The person does not make a fair choice between equals. Someone takes advantage of circumstances that leave them with no real choice. In 2022, a regional consultation held by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime described this as one of the least known but growing forms of trafficking worldwide. It remains least known because it hides inside hospitals and border crossings instead of alleys. It is growing because global demand for organs keeps rising while legal supply does not. Our composite dealer operates inside that gap. He is not a surgeon or a kingpin. He is the middleman who turns one person's desperate need and another person's poverty into a transaction that neither side fully controls. That distinction matters because organ trafficking is not simply an illegal sale between 2 willing customers. The defining issue is exploitation. Coercion, deception, or abuse of a position of vulnerability turns a person's circumstances into leverage. A person may speak the language of choice while facing conditions that make refusal feel impossible. The label therefore describes the relationship around the organ, not only the organ's movement. The 2022 UNODC consultation's description of the crime as among the least known and growing forms of trafficking also points to a visibility problem, not a license to treat every transplant as suspicious. Legitimate transplantation and illegal organ trafficking are not the same thing. The concern is the criminal process that uses vulnerability to obtain an organ. His mornings often start with scrolling, not scheming. He looks through local classified ads and social media posts from people quietly asking for fast cash, medical help, or a way out of debt. Research tracking this trade has found that victims are frequently recruited through advertisements and social platforms. They often approach traffickers because poverty has convinced them that this is their last available option, rather than because a stranger suddenly lured them away from the street. Someone who has run out of choices may reach toward the only hand extended to them. At that moment, the dealer does not need to rely on lies alone. He stands where a person's desperation meets an opportunity to profit. He offers information and access, but never the full truth about what happens afterward. The recruitment channel can look ordinary because the vulnerability is ordinary in appearance. A public advertisement, a social media post, or a request passed from one person to another. What makes the exchange dangerous is the imbalance behind the contact. The prospective donor may know that an organ is being discussed, yet still lack reliable information about payment, medical consequences, or support afterward. Deception can therefore operate through omission as well as through an explicit false promise. A last resort is not the same as a free and informed choice between equals. Once the dealer becomes the gatekeeper of information and access, the person seeking help is negotiating from a position the dealer did not create but can exploit. By midday, he is playing 2 roles at once. To the person willing to sell a kidney, he is a lifeline, offering money for a body part they were told they would barely miss. To the family desperate for a transplant, he is a solution who can make a waiting list disappear. Neither side sees the whole picture or the other's face. He controls the information that connects them. Research summarizing this trade has found that victims are told they can receive between $500 and $10,000 for their organ. The critical phrase follows the number. They may not be paid at all. The amount is neither fixed nor guaranteed. Traffickers move it up or down according to how much leverage they hold over someone who has nowhere else to turn. Families paying for access to an organ often pay far more than that amount. Most of the money moves through the network rather than to the person whose body supplied the organ. One 2017 estimate placed the entire global organ trade at between $840 million and $1.7 billion a year. That is not one dealer's income. It measures a shadow market built around the distance between medical need and legal access. The figures are useful only when their uncertainty remains visible. A possible payment range does not describe a dependable price, and the phrase, if they are paid at all, changes the meaning of every number that comes before it. It shows why the exchange cannot be understood as a simple bargain. The person taking the greatest bodily risk may have the least control over whether the promised money appears. The larger market estimate provides a different scale of context. It describes the estimated value of the organ trade in a 2017 Global Financial Integrity Report, as reported by OCCRP, rather than the earnings of this composite intermediary or a universal rate for any individual case. Between the recipient's need and the donor's expected payment, information remains the dealer's most valuable possession. No single person runs this operation. Studies tracing how these transplants happen describe a loose web rather than an organized crime syndicate with one boss. Multiple criminal networks and individual actors join forces temporarily, coordinating across borders to move a donor, a recipient, false paperwork, and a surgical team into the same place at the same time. The system works with real efficiency despite having no single command structure. Both sides of the transaction can be exploited within it. The donor is exploited for their body. The recipient may be exploited financially, medically, or both, paying enormous sums for procedures performed without oversight and with no guarantee of safety. This is not a story about greedy patients victimizing poor donors. It is a story about a system that creates victims on both ends, while the network in the middle profits most consistently. In 2023, the United Kingdom saw its first conviction of this kind. A Nigerian senator, his wife, and a medical broker were found guilty under the UK's Modern Slavery Act for conspiring to bring a young man from Nigeria into the country to serve as a kidney donor for their daughter. The court described it as a conspiracy built on someone else's poverty, misery, and despair. That case is documented, real, and separate from the composite dealer we are following. It shows the same architecture with real names and a real courtroom. A loose network can be difficult to see precisely because it does not require one permanent organization. Different actors can cooperate around a particular illegal transplant while remaining separate from one another. That flexibility does not make the system accidental. The Utrecht University summary describes globally collaborating networks and actors facilitating illegal kidney transplants in an extremely well-organized manner. The same arrangement can distribute responsibility while concentrating harm. A donor may be treated as an input, a recipient as a source of money, and the broker as the person who keeps the two sides from understanding the full arrangement. The documented United Kingdom case makes the stakes concrete without making it typical of every case. It demonstrates that exploitation for organ removal can be treated as human trafficking under law, not merely as a private dispute over payment. By evening, fear has taken over. He reroutes every call and reschedules every meeting twice before it happens once. Our composite dealer trusts neither his phone nor the patterns around him, and he no longer trusts the version of himself that other people meet during daylight. This part of the story is a reconstruction, not verified testimony, but it reflects what researchers describe about people operating inside criminal networks built on secrecy. Constant low-grade dread replaces any sense of control. He tells himself that he is helping people who had no other option and that the money changes someone's life. Research following actual victims tells a different story about what happens after the transaction closes. Analysis of prosecuted cases across the OSCE region found that victims typically receive no post-operative medical care or psychological support. Many never learn what organ removal will cost their bodies over the following years, including long-term health damage and, in some cases, the inability to work again. Often, the promised payment never fully arrives. The dealer moves on to the next message. The person who sold a kidney must live with what is now permanently missing. Fear also has a material source in the dealer's knowledge that promises can conceal consequences he cannot repair. Once the handoff is over, the intermediary can describe the transaction as finished, while the person recruited into it continues living with its effects. The OSCE region analysis is based on prosecuted cases, so it does not prove that every case has an identical outcome. It does, however, document a recurring pattern of missing follow-up care, missing psychosocial support, unpaid promises, and serious long-term consequences. That pattern strips away the fantasy that the dealer merely connects supply and demand. He connects a vulnerable person to a future the person may not have been equipped to understand. Trafficking in human beings for organ removal and the broader organ trade are condemned everywhere by every major medical and legal body on Earth. Yet research into global transplant practices has found that buying and selling organs continues, often through patients traveling to other countries for procedures unavailable to them legally at home. That contradiction drives the system. Governments condemn the trade on paper, while demand continues in practice. Wherever legal access falls short, someone builds a bridge across the gap, and someone else pays whatever toll that bridge requires. The dealer collects that toll. He did not create the gap, but he profits by leaving it open. The contradiction is not that prohibition makes the trade disappear and demand somehow replaces it. It is that condemnation and continued buying and selling exist at the same time. The documented tension includes patients traveling abroad, a practice often discussed as transplant tourism, to pursue procedures connected to that illegal market. That does not make every patient a trafficker or every cross-border transplant illegal. It does show how distance can separate the person seeking treatment from the person who bears the risk. For the dealer, that distance becomes a form of insulation. The people affected may never occupy the same room, yet their needs are linked through his promises. This trade does not stay sealed off in some distant part of the world. Organ waiting lists exist everywhere, and every year more people join them than can be matched with a legal donor. The pressure remains. It gets pushed quietly toward places where enforcement is weakest and desperation runs deepest. Reporting behind this story notes that traffickers have increasingly targeted refugees and asylum seekers in recent years. These people have already lost stability and must navigate systems that can make them invisible. Studying this trade means examining what happens at the far edge of a medical shortage that touches ordinary families everywhere. Legal patience ends, and desperation begins searching for alternatives. What is it like to live a double life as a black market organ dealer? It is not the glamorous underworld existence that fiction imagines. It is a person standing between two forms of desperation, profiting from the distance between them and hiding from accountability that he knows will eventually arrive. His apparent power comes from other people's limited choices. The donor believes this is the only path out of poverty. The recipient believes it is the only path to survival. The dealer believes neither one needs to know the other's name. Everyone in that chain becomes replaceable in some way. The question is not how someone enters this trade. It is what kind of system makes another person's organ, poverty, and desperation available for negotiation. Legal access to transplants still lags behind medical need. Poverty still leaves some people with fewer and fewer choices. As long as those conditions continue, the negotiation will happen somewhere, to someone, tonight.